the 16th episode in this series from MeidasTouch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can download the show as audio in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is economist, writer and founder of Eudaimonia & Co., Umair Haque. Umair, hi. Great to see you.
Hi. How are you?
I'm very good. It's very exciting for me because I'm a bit of a fanboy of yours, and you don't make many appearances, but you do write an essay every day pretty much. And
Yes.
with those essays, I feel deeply connected to you and your views. And
thank you.
so we'll disseminate some of them as we kind of continue the conversation. We've got three things to look at today. Climate change causing widespread and irreversible impacts. This was actually a report that was done in February by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But you have strong views and thoughts, and so we're going to look at how it seems to me, I was thinking that, the only climate activist that I can think of, that I can name, is Greta Thunberg. And yet, this is like the biggest thing in the world. So we'll work out why that is in just a little while. I want to talk about fascism and American exceptionalism. It's something we talk about on the show a lot, and it's hard for me as a British person to talk about American exceptionalism and not appear critical. So I want us to kind of understand really what it is, and that is in some ways connected to the Texas school shooting. I want to look at this today because we heard on Friday that the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety has said there was no excuse for officers not trying to break into the elementary school classroom where the gunman was killing 19 students and 2 teachers. I mean, where do we start with something like this? You've written many times about, guns and firearms. Really, my question to start us off is it the case that Republicans prefer their guns to their children?
It's such a horrific thing, right? I mean, it's at this point, it's kind of like the ritual slaughter of children, right? And in some sense, the way that Americans have these debates always breaks down along these age-old binaries, right? And if these age-old binaries were going to get Americans anywhere, God knows these problems would have been solved a long time ago. So for me, it's a very different question. And I would look at it much more through the lens of like, what the hell is wrong with a country like this, right? And a country is not just like politicians who don't do anything, or like lunatics with guns, or kids who get bullied at school, or what have you. I mean, I grew up in the States, and I went through the ringer at school and the whole 9 yards. For me, the story is much more about institutions, right? And in America, we see the development of what I would call shadow institutions. And so what are shadow institutions? Well, you have things like a coup attempt, right, which has now been celebrated on the right. You have things like death threats, which are now another kind of shadow institution, whether they're like fanatics sending it to, local election officials, right? Another kind of shadow institution, we were back in the States this year, back in a little town where I grew up in Virginia. A fellow named, as I'm sure you all know, named Glenn Youngkin got elected, proceeded to set up a tip line to turn in teachers. For what? I don't know. Saying the word gay? Shadow institution, right? So very Gestapo kind of shadow institution, very Stasi kind of shadow institution. Another shadow institution is the rise of like this kind of, it's school shootings, but I would almost put it in the rise of like almost guerrilla warfare, like vigilante justice that the right wing wants to make a real institution, right? So if we look at the huge raft of bills that are now squarely aimed at, undoing Roe versus Wade, a lot of those are about creating vigilante justice mechanisms, right? And so these school shootings kind of track almost in that path of social collapse, if you like, right? Just like people feeling like they can take matters into their own hands and do extreme violence to redress whatever fictional grievance they might have. And so for me, it's a much better way to look at the issue because, on the one side, America has a guns problem. This is 100% true. There's more guns than people in America, right? I think something like that. But there's a lot of societies with guns too. They don't have school shootings, right? I mean, if I go to the marketplace in a place like Pakistan, I can buy everything from an AK-47 to a rocket launcher, right? I mean, I can buy like extreme weapons of warfare that the crazy gun nut paramilitaries dream about owning. Take them in the back of my car, but nobody's shooting up schools there, right? So this is a broader question of social collapse, and it's a real question of social collapse. How do you develop a society where school shootings have become an institution? And when I say school shootings becoming an institution, I don't just mean the act of the mass murder itself, right? I mean, this whole weird sequence of events, right? So like, there's a school shooting, and then the Republicans say this for a day, and then the Democrats say this for a day, and then the Republicans backtrack and they blame it on mental illness, and then the Democrats say we can't do anything, and then the newspaper pundits come in and tell us why nothing can happen. And this goes on for like a month, and then the next one happens, right? So this institution, that's an institution of hardcore, really extreme social collapse, right? I mean, you cannot imagine this happening in any other country, even if this happened in the world's poorest countries. You know, I gave you the example of Pakistan. I don't know. Pick one.
Well, in the UK, we had one school shooting
Dunblane.
at Dunblane. They changed the law. They made ownership of firearms illegal.
Absolutely right.
There haven't been any school shootings since.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So from a legislative perspective, obviously that will work to a certain degree.
That will work to a certain degree.
And it is easier to pass legislation than it is to deal with this overall subject of social collapse.
Absolutely right. But
so where do we start? Where do we start with social collapse?
Look, Americans really need to understand social collapse. Okay, social collapse is not just something you can legislate away. The problem in social collapse is, in fact, that legislation ceases to matter or even goes backwards, as we see in the case of the Supreme Court, right? Repealing, like, I don't know, half a century's worth of rights, bang, like that, and hoping to go all the way back, right? To like Jim Crow and God knows what. So it's not just a question of legislation. And that's how this issue is portrayed in America. But the thing to understand is that social collapse kind of operates at a much more fundamental level than legislation. And the reason that legislation breaks down or even goes into reverse is that there is a collapse. Social collapse is a literal term, right? And so one of the things that it refers to is the collapse of trust in a society. And in America, you know, and when I say this, you know, it gets wrapped up in these weird American ideas. And Americans, you know, if you say the word trust, immediately they think of, I don't know, going to church or something. But we're not talking about that. We're just talking
in God
about
we
the
trust.
In God we trust, right?
Yeah.
God we trust, or in money we trust.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're talking about. So when we look at societies, high trust, low trust societies, right? So one of the problems that America has is that if we're talking about school shootings, the other examples of countries I gave you, they have guns, but they're also high trust societies. And that kind of stays the kind of hand of violence a little bit, right? So America's problem is that it has all these guns, but it's also a low trust society. And low trust really, really is a big problem. Low trust, you can see it when I go back to the States. I mean, it's visible on people's faces, right? I mean, I've been writing about this week. When I come back to Europe, they trust each other. You can see it.
Yeah, there is a culture of fear that I have experienced. I've lived in the US for 5.5 years, and I recognize, and even just on a WhatsApp group with parents of my daughter's school, I read this kind of constant level of fear. Now, obviously, we have cable news to thank for this. We have talk radio to thank for this. We have the media to thank for this in many ways.
Right. And so there's a link between low trust and fear. Now, the question is, so the next question becomes, well, is this just like a paranoid thing, right? This is like the paranoid style in American life, not just politics, as it were? And the answer to that question is no. There's a reason that people don't trust anything in America, right? So low trust is kind of like between people in institutions, between people in the government. I mean, it goes across parties in society, right? So between social groups, all of this kind of thing. So there's a reason for it. And that's that American life is incredibly brutal, incredibly violent. Survival of the fittest, right? This is a Darwinian society. And survival of the fittest is kind of like the principle by which everything operates. And so, Americans are put in a position that isn't true in any other rich country, which is that they have to go out and compete against everybody else for the basics.
It's the Wild West.
It's the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
But it's the Wild West, but it's 2022. And so if you're lucky enough to find yourself across the Canadian border or have been born in, I don't know, France or Germany or Belgium, what have you, there are certain things you get by virtue of citizenship, right? These are constitutional rights: healthcare, education, transportation, decent media. In a lot of European countries, even more abstract kind of things are basic rights, right? Like dignity, for example. Now, in America, we don't have any of those because our Constitution is totally obsolete, right? It's written way, way, way before this new generation of European constitutions, which were written after World War II. So those guys got cutting-edge constitutions, courtesy of the Marshall Plan, which was funded by America. But our Constitution is kind of a relic in these hard terms of political evolution. And so the question then for Americans becomes, well, how do you have access to these things that in every other rich country now are basic human rights? And in America, the answer has become, and there's a history there, you have to compete for them. You have to go out every day. You have to compete with everybody else in society for these things. A little bit of money, some health care, a roof over your head, way to pay the bills, all of which add up to bodily security, all of which add up to stability in society, all of which add up to financial security. The very, very basics are constantly under threat, right? And one tiny mistake in American life and everything can unravel, right? You lose your job, you lose your health care.
And we see that in an increasing homeless communities. We see that where you're really only a couple of phone calls away from poverty in the US.
Exactly right. But I think it's a mistake, especially a mistake that liberal pundits tend to make, right? I mean, and we all know the type, right? I mean, that they'll say, well, this is a problem of the lowest 5% in society. But it's not. 80% of Americans live this way, probably even more, right? So the financial statistics are gruesome. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and 70% can't, struggle to pay the bills. And financial insecurity is basically, not just the norm, but way, way, way above the norm. Something that, 80, 90% of Americans experience.
Yeah.
So,
and I experienced this a couple of days ago. I signed up for AT&T broadband, and they sent me a letter saying, congratulations, we're going to give you an AT&T credit card. It was a gift for signing up.
Right.
And I was fascinated by this because I was like, well, I hopefully am smart enough to know that I don't need debt and I don't need to be gifted debt. But the average person, I fear, might see that and feel that they've won something and be grateful to the service provider for gifting them more debt.
It's much worse than that. The average person needs it. The average person in America needs it. So America is in a very strange position that it's very difficult for people in a rich country to understand, which is that it's in a poverty trap. And a poverty trap means that Americans, because they live lives of financial insecurity, 80% living paycheck to paycheck and whatnot, they have to go into debt to make ends meet. It's impossible not to go into debt, right? So if I say that to Americans, they kind of don't really get what I mean, but it's very, very elementary what I mean. If you want to educate a kid, if you want to buy a car, you want to afford the basics of life, you're going into debt. And maybe that notion, that kind of way of organizing a society around debt worked in the 1950s, I don't know. And we can go back through the history of it and why it exists. And, this is the kind of thing that goes back to slavery, but it doesn't work anymore. Because now we have a kind of situation of intergenerational inequality that is so extreme, it's bizarre, right? Which is that every generation now is more and more indebted, and they earn less and less, and so they have no hope of ever paying off their debts. So they're indebted for life. So now the average American, and this is a mind-blowing statistic to me as an economist, and I don't think it's something that people talk enough about at all, average American dies in debt, right? I think the figure is something like $60,000 worth of debt. somewhere 40, 50, 60, something like that. Now, that debt is then going to be, many forms of it inherited by their kids. So what do we call a political system in which the average person is born in debt and they die in debt? Well, I hate to break it to you, but it's called peasantry. It's called serfdom, right? This is not amenable to a democracy. It's not amenable to a modern society. So the economics of all this are absolutely fatal. So when I began predicting American collapse, which was, a long time ago now, 10, 12 years now, it was because I saw these statistics beginning to emerge. For the first time, I think in 2010 it was, the middle class became a minority, and you could see all of these indicators heading south. And what happens when people end up in that position, that they're indebted for life, and because they're downwardly mobile, and every generation is doing worse than the one before it. Well, if we go back in kind of political theory, the optimistic answer that Karl Marx gave us was that, well, this is what capitalism does, and one day there will be a grand socialist revolution, and workers of the world will throw off their chains and the whole 9 yards. History proved him wrong. What tends to happen in this situation is fascism. This is exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic, right? Yeah. This is exactly what happened in many, many nations. So when we see these poverty traps, debt traps, intergenerational inequality, downward mobility, all emerging simultaneously, middle class disappearing, a society having this weird distribution where you have a tiny, tiny number of superrich and this huge hump of, an underclass, basically, who's in debt for life. It's a bad scene, man. It predicts fascism, and that's what
you wrote about this on the 18th of May. You wrote a piece called "Why Fascism is Seducing the World Again,"
right? And
how how society creates too many losers. And this is a theme when I read your pieces, Umair. A couple of days ago, America's collapsing at light speed, and it gets worse every day. What would you say to critics who see the way in which you write? Because it's not tabloid. I come from a country where the tabloids kind of use exploitative language, and I'm very pleased to be away from that. I didn't ever appreciate the tabloid press. But the way you write is different. You write in an alarmist way, and I think you would admit that it is alarmist because you are trying to sound the alarm. And this is, I guess, something that, because we never hear in the American media or American politicians, they never talk about poverty. They never talk about average people being in poverty. We don't talk about the poor like we talk about the poor in England. So, and obviously there's no fear of climate change because people here seem to think that, well, that's not our problem. That's going to, even Ron DeSantis said it was a Democrat thing. So how do you address the balance when you write between being a alarmist or sounding the alarm, but also being factual? Because these types of conversations that we're having today, where you go beneath the surface, are not being had in American society.
No, not at all. So I was an establishment kind of figure in America for a long time, right? I mean, I wrote for Harvard Business Review for, 10 years or something, and I had the most popular column there by a very long way for ages, and I've written for The Atlantic, and God knows what. I mean, go down the list. So it's not that I don't know how to write in the way that the American kind of psyche and the American establishment has conditioned people to respond to. It's that I grew up in a much more European culture, right? So I went off to college in Canada, and I moved to London, and I spent a lot of time in Paris and all 9 yards. So my style of writing is much more European because that's how I tend to think. And that comes across to Americans as alarmist. And you're right that I am trying to ring the alarm, but everything that we've talked about today, everything that you'll read that I write we're just talking about facts. I've quoted you dozens of facts already, right? Downward mobility, intergenerational inequality. Go down the list. I mean, we can keep talking about facts till the cows come home. Americans are not used to... Let me put this to you in a different way. Europeans are always a little bit alarmed, right? If you go to Paris in the summer, you're not going to be able to get across the city because God knows somebody is protesting somewhere. Right? Maybe it's the teachers, maybe it's the waiters, maybe it's the doctors. Who knows?
Right. But they had a revolution in their history, and I think everybody is reminded in the same way as in London, we had the Blitz, and so we are constantly reminded, right? Yeah.
Now, the American psyche is very different. Americans are used to hearing this kind of sober tone of gravitas coming from their their power figures, and they associate this kind of sober tone with analytical veracity, if you like. And those two things don't really go hand in hand, right? Americans are not used to hearing that the worst case scenario may be coming true. They're not used to hearing how all of these multiple dots connect and reinforce each other, even though I think a lot of them have begun to figure it out for themselves. So there's a real tone problem in American media too, right? I mean, just look at the way, I don't know, look at the way CNN interviews the Republicans. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Like, these are guys who are okay with kids being massacred at school over and over again, and CNN is like, "Sir, do you agree that guns are bad for society?" It's
Yeah.
insane. It's crazy,
It's
right?
shocking to those of us who are used or exposed to European journalism,
Yeah,
where there is actual journalism, and
yeah.
I guess
If, yeah,
that news and entertainment
yeah,
have kind of
yeah.
fused in America.
If you read, exactly right. So Americans are used to kind of infotainment, right?
Right.
And in infotainment, you can take two approaches, right? You can either totally trigger the paranoid delusional conspiracy mindset, or you can be that sober middle of the road guy that, every CNN anchor is trying to be. Now, when I was an establishment writer in America, I came to a crossroads, right? Which was that I was writing for Harvard Business Review for a very long time. And, I started thinking about this issue of, this is the financial crisis of 2008 had happened, right? And it was obvious to me that the system is not working, right? It's not seriously broken for a financial crisis that huge to have engulfed the world yet again. And even beneath that, right? Just looking at the statistics of climate change and the economics of, our civilization, it was clear to me that things were not heading in the right direction. Now, an interesting thing happened, which is that when I began to write about this stuff, it wasn't a very welcome perspective, let me tell you. So there's a certain line that you have to toe in American media, for sure. Um, and, like we were talking about before the interview, I'm not a guy that ever wanted to be a writer. I'm not a guy that ever wanted to be a pundit. You see the keyboards in the back, all I really care about is music. I'm a musician at heart, man. So I could care less about writing it to please the establishment. It makes absolutely no difference to me. And the idea of sounding the alarm, I think I mean, listen, take a look around the world, right? I mean, if you're not alarmed, I don't know what planet you're living on, right? I mean, things are going from bad to worse, and so these are real problems, right? And I didn't, how can I put this? There's a certain career path if you're an American. Let me put it a different way. In Europe, we have the institution of the public intellectual, right? And public intellectual is a figure that inspires much mockery and much animus, but it's a thing, right? And so you can go to a bookstore in France and get little tracts by public intellectuals, right, to this day, full of radical ideas and God knows what. And you can pick up the newspaper and read a very different style of writing that comes down from that tradition. So if we look at, did you see Le Monde's editorial on the Texas massacre?
Yeah.
It pulled absolutely
Yeah.
no punches.
Yeah,
Like,
as they have done with atrocities in France. This
yeah,
is the thing that
absolutely
they
right.
are known for, right?
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. So I am not interested in being that kind of figure in America, which I think already exists way too much of and serves absolutely no purpose. Does the world really need another? Does the world really need another liberal pundit who's going to tell you that everything's okay, even though, climate change is hitting 50 degrees and kids are being massacred and, we can go down the list, right? I mean, Really? Does the world need that guy?
But isn't this the problem, is that we have people like yourself who are great thinkers and known as thinkers and writers, who have a narrative which is rarely getting exposed in the mainstream.
Oh, yeah.
It's thought of as fringe, unfortunately.
Yeah,
And even
absolutely.
historical fringes, you know, the historical thinkers are thought of as fringe and ridiculed. In, you know, Noam Chomsky is sometimes ridiculed for being, you know, being out there.
Yeah.
But what we're dealing with now is a situation where fascism is rising in America. It's getting worse and worse. You've written multiple times about the rise of fascism in the West. And yet there seems to be this disconnect between the intellectual thinking, the media, broadcasting, and then, of course, you would never hear Joe Biden refer to fascism. You would never, and in fact, Donald Trump, when he was president, he designated Antifa, anti-fascists, a terrorist organization.
That's right.
Meaning that he was the fascist because they opposed him.
Right.
Right? And so he was admitting to being a fascist without saying the words. So we're in this situation. This is partly why I started 5 Minute News, was basically because I saw there was a gap in the market for truthful, thought-provoking news. How do we bridge that gap? I mean, this is my greatest fear, because there's a huge argument being had on the right. The left are being very typical with their debate about this school shooting, not saying anything new. And yet you're saying this is not a guns issue, this is social collapse.
Look, let me try and address a number of those issues. Look, we have a big problem in America with the sanitized infotainment nonsense, right? How is it that, so in this conversation, we've talked about a number of things which anybody, right, even a grade school kid should be able to understand. When we're talking about concepts like intergenerational inequality or downward mobility or debt traps, even a kid can understand. So why is it that we don't hear about them or talk about them, right? Why is it that, it's seen as some kind of fringe thing to bring this stuff up? It's a pathetic excuse for a kind of, culture, media industry that we have at the moment. And the problem is that in itself is another institution of social collapse, right? Because people then end up in a situation where they can't really understand, like, society's collapsing around them and they can't make any sense of it. And it keeps happening faster and faster and faster. And they turn off the news and they're doom scrolling Twitter and, that sense of breathless kind of like abandon. What's going to happen tomorrow? Instead of actually sitting down and trying to piece this thing together and figure it out. Now, if you look at these statistics, right, they should have told you 10 years ago, like they told me, like they would have told any good economist, right? I mean, this is stuff that the better European economists were talking about very openly 10 years ago, right? That we've had this huge financial crisis and it's caused a wave of austerity and it's going to cause a wave of nationalism and who knows what happens after that. We don't discuss any of these principles in America, right? We pretend like history doesn't exist. We pretend like social science doesn't exist. We pretend like economics is the stuff that the right wing makes up, right? Like Elon Musk is going to go to Mars and we'll all be billionaires and live in computers in the Mars cloud or something. What have you today, right? And so this comes back to a problem on the center and the left. We have lost our way in epic terms. If we go back half a century, not even, 70s, right? The left and the center had big goals, and they agreed on those goals. And those were goals that if I say them today to people on the left, they get mad at me for saying them. We're talking about things, of course, like ending war forever, ending violence forever, ending hunger forever. The project of human civilization. Now we have a left that has completely given up on those things, right? It's not interested in those things. It's fighting these tiny local scale battles, right? And that approach is not working. The right, the hard right, on the other hand, now has mutated into this bizarre kind of like newly globalized Frankenstein kleptomaniac monster where they're stealing each other's ideas, right? So Orban in Hungary feeding the minds of the fanatics in America, taking inspiration from Putin and God knows what, right? So
and Bolsonaro in Brazil, but also
Bolsonaro.
Boris Johnson in England. I mean, Boris Johnson is becoming increasingly exposed as somebody who is really quite unhinged in many ways. But isn't the bigger picture conversation when it comes to social collapse and the reason that Americans refuse to hear critique and accept critique, doesn't that kind of lead into our next topic of American exceptionalism? And isn't that really at the heart of all of this? This complacency over mass shootings, which could arguably lead to a much darker future. In fact, Jack Crosby wrote a piece in the New Statesman this week saying that at its worst, exceptionalism discourages people from seeking to change things. Yes. Dictators and authoritarians often provide social services at whatever level they think will keep people complacent, and all too often use examples to show that things could be worse. And the transition from a flawed but functioning free society to one in an authoritarian grasp can be subtle. I mean, is that what we're dealing with now?
Right. That's
because
100%
I mean,
correct.
A British journalist doorstepped Ted Cruz at an event a couple of days ago, right? And Ted Cruz couldn't answer the question about why America is the only country in the world to see school shootings like this.
But it took a British journalist to do it.
It did, and then Ted Cruz lost it. Came back to the guy and said, America is the greatest country in the world. Why do you think everybody wants to live here? That's American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah. American exceptionalism is a powerful drug. And to really understand it, you need to understand it. You need to really have experienced it, I think. Having lived in Europe and Britain for so long, there is a sense in other countries that they've made their mistakes, right? And people understand the downsides of their national character to the extent that they've become jokes, right? So if I say to one of my French friends, oh, you're, sitting in a corner and pondering death today, it's funny, right? It's a joke. I say to my British friends, oh, what are you doing tonight? Hammered at the pub and snog some random stranger, right? I mean, it's a joke, right? So we understand the downsides of our national character. Now, the interesting thing is that you can't do that with Americans. You can't joke about their national character in any way, because if you do anything, the moment that I say Americans, one thing happens. Americans get really mad at me for saying Americans, because they don't think of themselves as a group in any way. They don't think of themselves having anything in common, which of course is the thing that they have in common, right? Which is that sense of like hostility, that sense of like anger. So exceptionalism is a hell of a powerful drug. And it's hard for people outside the States to understand, because it is acculturated and socialized into you in America from the day you're born in ways that people outside the country will never be able to fully grasp. So you go to the school, you say the Pledge of Allegiance. Every morning, I say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and you put your hand on your heart, I don't remember. You have your school plays where you're reenacting skits from George Washington or God knows who, right? So stuff is really, really drilled into you. And then...
But that's patriotism, right? That's patriotism.
That's patriotism. But, so beginning from that foundation, then you grow up and you kind of go into a system of culture and education which is totally ignorant of the world. So when I went to college in Canada, one of the very first things they did was sit us down and teach us how basically the structure of Canadian society and law in big ways, differs from America. They said very simple things to us, like, hey, we don't allow pharmaceutical ads here. You want to know why not? This is why not. Our channels here will have this much local content. You want to know why? Here's why. We have a healthcare system. This is why. Now, in America, the opposite is true. You can go to the finest Ivy League university, and God knows I've given lectures, and God knows what. You will never learn a damn thing about a single other country in the world. And so you come out of that set of Ivy League graduates coming out of these places, and they think they've received the finest educations on planet Earth. they don't know a damn thing about how the Canadian healthcare system works, how the French pension system works, how the German economy works, how the Swiss government works. They have no idea how the
And
world
arguably, the education about America's history is
and
somewhat
yeah, right, and
questionable
right,
anyway,
right,
right?
and we'll get right.
Yeah,
It's completely questionable.
yeah.
And so this class graduates and they become the power figures. They become the pundits and the politicians and the writers and God knows what. And they've never learned a damn thing about the world. And they barely learned a damn thing about America itself, because what can you really learn about America without understanding the world? And so if you go to them after this process of acculturation and socialization and miseducation has happened, and you say something factual to them, they get very mad at you. So one of the things that I often say to these guys, I write about it all the time. It's just like just a little line that really helps put, America's problems in perspective, for me at least, is that it was an apartheid state until the 70s, right? State where I grew up, Virginia, interracial marriage very famously was illegal until 1973, I think, 1971, something like that. Apartheid
Segregation, effectively, which is a fear.
That will go back.
There is a fear that it could return, because this is now, I mean, we already heard a Republican senator accidentally say that interracial marriage,
right,
should be looked at.
Right. And going back to your Jack Crosby example, none
Yeah.
of these things are accidents. Right?
No.
These are not accidents. These are trial balloons.
Yeah.
This is how authoritarianism works. This is how fascism works. So you put up the trial balloon, and you kind of deflate the sense of public anger, and then you keep pushing another. You keep doing it 3 times, 4 times. So by the 5th time, people have forgotten. The apathy has taken over. The flip side of that, as Crosby was saying, is that you make a public example out of someone, just to show how bad it could really be. And we see that happening too. Right? So with the, and in some senses, that's the point of the extreme end of the right-wing violence, to really intimidate a society, to really kind of teach it who's boss. Right? So all of this stuff is intimately connected. And the problem that we have, going back to your original question, is that in America, the exceptionalism runs so deep that now people are in this weird state of cognitive dissonance, right? They look around them, and I mean, come read the comments on my website, man, and you'll see how many Americans are out there being like, oh my God, Jesus, I can't believe it. Like, why don't I have healthcare like Canadians? Or why don't I have a decent pension like French people, or what have you? There's a lot of them. So they're waking up and they're understanding that America is exceptional, but kind of in the wrong way at the moment, right? And so this cognitive dissonance, like, how did we get here? And the answer to that question is that American exceptionalism, we think of it as kind of this idea, right? But it's not really an idea. It's more than that. It's a way of life. And American exceptionalism also means, we think of it as that, America's exceptionalism, it's above the laws of history and the whole 9 yards. It also means, though, at the individual level, that people accept the idea that you have to be exceptional to have a decent life, right? That's what it kind of boils down to. Right?
And it transcends class, doesn't it?
And it transcends,
because,
of course.
That's something that's most noticeable for me as a European moving to the US, is how we, areas are spoken about as, high net worth areas.
Yeah.
They refer to an area as a good area because people in that area earn a good living.
Exactly right.
So success is measured by wealth, and in a way that's arguably how Trump got elected, because they thought he was rich and therefore he was smart, and yet the two are not mutually exclusive.
So I think it's really important to trace the kind of the genealogy of that idea, if you like. So an exceptional society, one that's above the laws of history, not going to happen to us. It can't happen here, right? Number one. Number two, an exceptional society therefore also has to be a place where exceptional people are, right? And so now we're already coming within spitting distance of this kind of very Nietzschean ideals of the Übermensch and the Zarathustra and all of this kind of stuff of, the master versus the slave, and it's getting a little uncomfortable, right? And now we look at America and you begin to think, well, in some sense it's true that, this is a society where if you are exceptional in some way, yes, you can have a kind of stellar life. I don't know, celebrity Elon Musk, God knows who, Johnny Depp, if I can use that uncomfortable
Interesting examples. But yeah.
Yeah, but that link between having a decent life and being an average person is completely severed, right? So it's not okay to be average in America. And that's a big problem. Because if you cannot be average and be okay in life, have financial stability, have a place in society, have meaningful work, have some kind of confidence that your kids are going to go on and do a little bit better than you, the whole project of civilization begins to break down. So in that sense, exceptionalism is a very Nietzschean concept, right? And it is a natural fit with the American psyche because...
Well, I was going to say the American dream. I mean, it's right, isn't it?
Right.
Because that's something that I'm not familiar with in the
Right.
UK. We're so self-deprecating, you know,
Right.
because we were bombed to shit. Let's be
Right.
honest,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
somehow being
Yeah.
a tiny country, we managed to colonize half the planet,
Yeah.
and so there are these constant contradictions. But I feel that here the American dream is one that supersedes that exceptionalism, and it plays into that exceptionalism.
Well,
And so how
yeah.
are these two things connected in your mind?
There's a big problem with it, right? I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the American dream. I mean, look, the idea of exceptionalism is in some sense the opposite of the project of civilization, right? Because the project of civilization says, hey, it doesn't matter who you are. You're going to get an education, food, water, money, a place to live, blah, 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 blah. Civilization. We are all going to be civilized, and by giving everybody the basics, we are going to forestall violence and conflict. From the very beginning, we are going to create the conditions for cooperation, and decency will emerge out of those preconditions. Now, the idea of exceptionalism is almost the polar opposite of that. It says, well, we are an exceptional country, and you don't deserve anything. You have to prove that you're exceptional to really be one of us. Okay? And once you kind of get your head around that, it's very easy to understand how America became the only rich country, and by now probably the only middle-income country, without any kind of functioning social systems. Right? Hey, if you're exceptional, why do you need them? Nobody here is average. We don't need to be normal in that sense. So it's a very difficult nut to crack because it's so bound up with the mythology. And that comes back to the American dream, which again is a very interesting idea, right? So what is the American dream? I mean, I grew up in, right? I mean, I'm sure many of us did, in some bizarro version of the American dream, right? A little suburban house on a cul-de-sac, kicking the ball down the street and whatnot.
And yet one day you could be president. I mean, that's really what it boils down to.
One day you can be president. And
right,
you
can do anything you want. And
right,
that's why I guess people like Barack Obama were very helpful in galvanizing the American dream.
Well,
because
yes and no. Right.
People looked up to him and thought, well, he had a very a typical background, as in, a single parent family and didn't know his father, this type of stuff. And yet he was able to achieve the highest office arguably in the world.
Right.
So he really kind of baked home that idea that the American dream is still possible. Hence why he ran on this concept of hope, and it worked.
Right. And so this is the essence of the American dream, right? It's kind of a thing of optimism and hope. And it's a kind of thing of optimism and hope for a certain kind of life, right? And when you picture the American dream, and maybe you don't do it, Anthony, because you're not American, but the average American who pictures the American dream is thinking of a very specific thing in their head. They're thinking of like a suburban house.
A Cadillac,
or whatever it is now, a Tesla or whatever in the garage, and, a little affluent neighborhood with maybe a Whole Foods down the street or what have you. So that's the dream, right? Now, it's interesting to me because what's not in that dream? Well, there's no public goods in that dream, right? There's no the American dream isn't like, hey man, I have a world-class public hospital down the street and I have a great public university and my pension's taken care of, and all this stuff that European social democracy takes for granted. Right? So we don't speak of a European dream, but there is most definitely such a thing, right? And, it's funny, Eurovision just happened, right? And Americans love to mock Eurovision, and Europeans love to mock Eurovision. Everybody mocks Eurovision, but the tone is different. It's very gentle and soft in Europe. It's not biting, and so Eurovision is a very interesting example because it was set up. I don't know if many people know this, but Eurovision was set up as a cultural project to promote peace between
Right.
European nations.
Right.
Right. And so now today is this cheesy song contest, but it still works.
Yeah.
Right. You saw
It's
Ukraine
the
win.
it's the UN it's the UN of the music
It's
business.
the UN of
right?
pop culture.
Yeah.
Right. It's cheesy as hell, but
Yeah.
as an institution, it works beautifully and powerfully well. Once a year, all of Europe and half the world comes together and looks at this funny shit that these guys are doing, and they all laugh and sing together. It is a glorious and remarkable achievement for human civilization. So,
And we saw with Ukraine winning,
and we saw with
that
Ukraine winning the power.
at a time of conflict,
Yeah,
that just showed, even though Ukraine clearly didn't have the best song,
exactly.
that it was necessary for
Yeah.
all the countries to come together in support
Yeah.
of a country that was being invaded by a fascist regime.
Exactly right. Now, the reason I brought up that example was because this summer, I think, maybe it's coming out this summer. It's coming out soon. Maybe it's already out. I don't follow this stuff that closely. Some production companies had the bright idea to make a quote unquote American Eurovision, right? But they've completely missed the point. That was a cultural institution set up to promote peace. Now it's become like what is that, American Idol kind of thing, right?
Right. Well, they probably did it because they thought they could make money out
They
of it.
could make money
and,
out of it, right?
And the dollar is
right.
king.
But this is the difference, that now it's become something that's about winning versus something that's about sharing. And so the American dream is very much this. It's about private ownership, and it's about winning. It's about attaining a certain status in society. And, it's not that that's a bad dream. It's that it's just you can't base a whole society on it.
So let's answer the question that Ted Cruz presented, and that was, why is it that everybody wants to come here? Because if America is so broken,
Yeah.
if education is so bad,
Yeah.
if healthcare is non-existent, and if school shootings are prevalent, and there is an increasing shift to the right, and the rise of fascism is clear, because we now have these vigilantes, that the Kyle Rittenhouse characters, and we'll see more and more of this, I presume. Why do people still want to come to America in their droves? And I include myself in this because I chose to leave England
Yeah.
and relocate to the United States.
Well, I mean, look, there's a certain type of Brit who has a real peculiar fascination with America, Anthony. I don't know if you follow that category or not, but there's always, the guy
I love it.
about it. They've always been there, right? So, look, the right's typical answer to this is, hey, everybody still wants to come to America. No, everybody doesn't want to come to America. Are you kidding me? You just go to talk to my European friends at the dog park, and they're horrified at the idea of even visiting America. They're very happy in their lives in Stockholm or Madrid or Barcelona or Paris or what have you. There's very little immigration at that level. Who is coming to America, obviously, are immigrants from, southern Latin America. And a lot of those guys, at this point, are kind of crossing the line from being refugees of hardcore failed states, economic migrants, as they're called in America, which is, not perhaps such a great term for them, to being almost climate change refugees at this point, right? Because the climate is heating up. A lot of the agriculture in those regions is agriculturally very intensive regions, and the harvests are kind of declining year by year. The water supply is questionable at best. You can go down the list. And so, yeah, of course, they're going to try and go where they can, right? In the same way that somebody from Afghanistan might try to flee to Pakistan. Doesn't mean that, right?
Yeah. And America is a nation built by immigrants, and this is something that seems to have suddenly been forgotten, doesn't it? When talking about the southern border, or talking, or building the wall, or all of these things, it's kind of, Donald Trump would be proud of his what was his Scottish heritage he claimed turned out to be untrue. But I mean,
right.
you know, Joe Biden is Irish. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, we hear this all the time. And I have friends who are very proud of being Italian Americans. You know, they're very proud of the immigration. And yet there is this constant contradiction. And we've heard, you know, the notion of politicians referring to them as illegals. I hate that phrase. It's so offensive because it doesn't take asylum into account. Can we just talk for a second about the article that you wrote on the 20th of May? The age of extinction is here. Some of us just don't know it yet. And I've quoted you a few times about your friends that you wrote about in the Indian subcontinent, telling you stories that seem like science fiction, the heat wave there pushing the boundaries of survivability. We've seen temperatures in that area now are so high that humans cannot live in that environment. Climate change is kind of the elephant in the room. You know, I think Americans think climate change is a bit of a joke. And as I said earlier, Ron DeSantis had referred to it as Democrat stuff. It's been politicized. You know, the legacy of Trump, you know, he, as you know, reversed all of the environmental protections that were you know, helping meet this target that was set at the Paris Climate Accord, which we've now missed effectively. That is now history. Sure. The reality is, and here in Ventura County in California, you know, they've seen warming of 3.6, 3.7 degrees. I mean, it's unprecedented. How do we, and this is like the final part of our conversation, but it's also maybe the end of the world conversation as well. How do we manage all of these kind of macro conversations when the reality is that this planet has a ticking clock on it? And, you know, we're fighting over guns and school shootings and left and right and all of this kind of push me, pull you. And the reality is that the elephant in the room is climate change.
Well, exactly right. Look, if you take a look at the world and you look at the politics of the world, the very first thing you should notice is, right, fascism exploded over the last 20 years, almost everywhere, right? America, India, China, go down the list. Russia, doesn't matter. And those are the politics of a collapsing civilization. And, you know, economically, we're a collapsing civilization. And economically, we are a civilization with a failed economy, right? So, again, this is the kind of thing, going back to our earlier conversation, where the minute I say it, you know, some harebrained liberal pundit will be like, oh, Umair's an alarmist, he's making stuff up, oh my God, his head will explode with liberal rage. It's a fact. These are simple facts. The average income of a person in our civilization is about $10,000. Okay, now, $10,000 a person. To produce that $10,000 a person, we have created already 1 degree of global warming. 1 degree, global warming, doesn't sound like much. And this is an American problem. Infotainment treats it as, if they even talk about it, it's 1 degree. It's not 1 degree in regions where it gets hot, right? It's like 10 degrees.
Because the media will report on a extreme weather event, a flood or something, you know, crazy, but they won't mention climate change in that report. There's a disconnect between extreme weather that is increasing and climate change.
And they won't make the link at all of you know, that we're at this many degrees of warming globally, and that means this many degrees of warming locally, and that means this much extreme weather here, and that means this many deaths across the world. So how many people died of climate change last year? Right? There's a number for this. There's a fact. 5 million people. That's a lot of people. That's more than COVID. That's almost as much as the Holocaust. That number is going to rise exponentially. And it's going to rise exponentially because that 1 degree of warming already means that in places like the Indian subcontinent, 50 degrees, 10 degrees higher than normal. Spain, hit pushing 40, 45. Southern regions, 5 degrees, 7 degrees hotter than normal, right? So 1 degree is catastrophic. It's a variation of up to 10 degrees in equatorial regions.
But the future president, Donald Trump, he would think of the Indian subcontinent as a shithole country.
Oh, yeah.
And so it doesn't matter because, you know, again, the American exceptionalism kicks in. And to him, he wouldn't be able to make that connection. So even if his advisors said, please, sir, he's still talking about windmills and cancer.
Oh, absolutely right. Listen, climate change is going to be the biggest gift that fascism has gotten in the history of human civilization.
Right.
By a very long way. And you can already see it happening, right? If you understand that all these migrants kind of heading north from scorching regions now towards the States, a lot of them are essentially climate change refugees. And yet the Republicans obviously demonize them in every way they can. It's the greatest gift the fascists are ever going to get, right? Imagine what happens in a place like India, which is already simmering over with religious tensions, as 50-degree summers become the norm, right? And water systems fail, and energy grids fail, and there's not enough food to go around, and cities have to be abandoned. Whose fault is it?
And air conditioning just doesn't work in these temperatures.
Stuff, right. I mean, we're hitting that. We're going to hit that threshold very soon, right? Wet bulb temperature. So that's the point at which everything stops, right? The human body cannot perspire anymore. Air conditioning doesn't matter. The whole 9 yards. So that's an upper limit, right? 60 degrees-ish around. Our civilization is cooked, right? So 60 degrees, how do we get there from where we are? Well, maybe it's 3 to 4 degrees global warming. We don't really know, but something around there, and we're well on course for that, right? So we have multiple layers of interlocking problems here. But again, let's boil this down to simple economics, because economics drives all of the stuff that we are talking about. And I really want people to understand that this is for real. This is not a joke. So when I say that we are a collapsing civilization, what do I mean? It means that $10,000 of income a person, we have an investment rate of 25% of that, okay? So we invest 25% back in everything that we invest in. Hospitals, schools, roads, blah, 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 blah. Between 20 and 25%. That's it. That's what our civilization does, okay? Now, what does 20% of an investment rate get you? 20% as an investment rate gets you very, very little. The only region in the world that we know that has successfully reduced its climate emissions, its carbon emissions, its greenhouse gases is Europe. Europe has an investment rate of 50%. It's more than double. Who has an investment rate of 20%? America. And we know what America looks like. It has decrepit roads. It has schools full of massacres. It has non-functioning systems of every kind. It has no social contract. 20% gets you social collapse. So we have to raise our investment rate. We have to more than double it from 20, 25% to 50%, probably north, in the next, 2 decades? Maybe 3 decades, if that, to have any hope of stopping this train wreck. Now, this is a very different way to think of it than the way that, unfortunately, we do think of it. I've painted a very simple picture for you of civilizational economics. These are the facts. Now, the way that we often look at this situation is to read, those of us who are interested, which is very few of us, certainly not many enough in the American media, is to pour through these IPCC reports and what have you. Right? The IPCC reports and whatnot are, they lay out their scenarios and blah, 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 blah. And, it's dense, it's very impenetrable. And they gloss over the realities of these civilizational economics, that our investment rate is fatally low. And what does a low investment rate do? Why is America collapsing? Because its investment rate was too low. It had a chance. In the post-war, how did Europe end up with a 50% reinvestment rate? Well, America stepped in with a Marshall Plan. And ever since then, Europe had the idea, right? Europe's idea was, well, if we guarantee everybody the basics, that's the best chance we have for peace. So we're not doing it out of the kindness of our noble European hearts, giving everybody great media and healthcare and transportation and the whole 9 yards. It's to prevent violence and conflict and war. That's why we're doing it. And
America has the money, and it has the space. I mean, Biden could use the Defense Production Act when he's finished with baby formula to make solar panels so that every area of land that is not used for harvest is harnessing the power of the sun. That every coastline around the entire United States has wind turbines. I mean, why is there not this appetite? And with alarmist materials like yours, which woke me up. You know, I was like, wow, because you basically said this is end of days.
This is the end game. Look,
Yeah.
what my friends in the subcontinent, I woke up to a message from my cousin telling me that he found a dead falcon on top of his car. And it was so hot that nobody could breathe. It's not a joke.
And we've also heard that climate change could have contributed to the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
And that climate change could, could be behind monkeypox. It could be the cause of the next pandemic.
Absolutely
And so
right.
we're going to see plagues and pestilence and all of these things that have been written. Right.
There's a very interesting article in Nature, I don't know if you saw it, that came out last month that, basically said increased human-animal contact, which is an effect of climate change as habitats shrink.
And because they can't migrate in the way that they could
migrate,
previously.
So they're trapped. Yeah. And that is going to get so much worse, so much faster. So again, if you think about a place like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, well, where do you go to cool off? The mountains. That's where every living thing is going to go. And where every living thing is going to the highlands, boom, you have a viral explosion, right? So again, I'm not making this up. Go read Nature.
And there'll be a water shortage there as well. There won't be enough water to go around.
People in the subcontinent right now are living at the end of the world. Okay? It's 50 degrees. Birds are falling out of the sky. The electricity's only on a few hours a day. If you get clean water, you count yourself lucky. And we don't hear about it here because those guys take it with good grace. Right? And they don't kind of like kick up a fuss about it, and we're not really interested anymore.
It goes back to your original point of what is a civilization and living in a civilized society.
And what is alarmism, right?
Yeah.
So if those guys over there were to tell us, hey man, the birds are dropping dead out of the sky, the energy grids have failed, we can barely get clean water, it's hard to breathe. I think a lot of our media will turn around and say, hey, why are you being such an alarmist? Everything's going to be fine. It's just a hot summer. But it's, we're not living in that world anymore, right? So we're used to this kind of fiction of a post-war world of like linearity and stability, right? And it's predicated on these few institutions that kind of have this linear, stable thing. So like GDP or, economic growth or, I don't know, the inflation rate or what have you. But now all of this stuff is boom, bang, spiraled out of control, right? So we've hit a point of discontinuity in all this stuff. And the situation is going to get much, much worse very, very fast. And we, frankly, the reason that I talk about civilizational economics with you is because we don't have any understanding of it, and we need it now. Because if we do not do something to address our failed civilizational economics, it is game over for us within our lifetimes. We need the biggest wave of investment in human history right now, and we need it across the planet. And this is going back to, we were talking about the right and the left. The left does not, where's the left, right? Like, we need the biggest wave of investment in human history. And here I am, I'm spelling it out for you in hard dollar terms. And whenever I talk about this subject to like the left, they're completely uninterested, right? They're
picking smaller battles.
They're picking smaller battles, and
unfortunately, it doesn't wash. I mean, to me, it's a bit like a disaster movie, isn't it? It's like there is a construct to a script for a disaster movie.
Yeah.
And I see really very much the points in which the narrative now is building. I can predict the ending because I've seen so many of these films.
Yeah.
And America, my greatest fear, because I love America and I have no intention of leaving this country. However, I recognize that there is an inability to self-critique and to look around. And really, people get more excited about Netflix and chill than, because, that is it's a comfort. Yeah. And the concept of like being in control of your electronic program guide is something you can do. Whereas climate change, well, what can I do? And that concept of collective responsibility is not really a thing here, is it?
The concept of collective action, the concept of public interest, the concept of common good is totally absent there. And it's not, look, my life is an accident, right? Like, I ended up this person because all the Ivy Leagues rejected me that I applied to in America. And I was lucky enough to get into college in Canada. And I went to Canada and my mind was blown. I was like, wait, these kids are actually being nice to each other. There's a concept of common good here. There's something beyond individualism and materialism here. And so,
well, they call it America without the guns, right?
Right.
You know,
right.
yeah.
And so it was very like, my mind was completely blown by this complete difference in attitudes. And so, you know, my life is a complete accident. And I think most Americans' lives at this point are like that, right? They're an accident of history. It's not, there's no design to this stuff, right? Societies fall into these traps, debt traps, poverty traps, the fascism they produce, the demagogues and the lunatics who feed on it, the bottom feeders who are even lower than them. And it takes on a life of its own. And this is where we are with climate change, right? There was no design behind it. Nobody sat down like 500 years ago in the industrial the Renaissance led to the Industrial Revolution and was like, hey guys, we're going to cook the planet alive. This is a byproduct, right? It's just a situation we find ourselves in.
But is this how the human race is wiped out, in the same way that the dinosaurs were wiped out by the comet? I mean,
Well,
is climate change the comet, or is COVID or the next pandemic, is that the comet?
Well,
I mean, is there'll be no crater like that, you know, you can
No.
go look at.
Look, I'm not, you know, I'll tell you, I don't really mind when Americans call me alarmist or what have you. But what does bug me is the fact that it is a way to preclude any kind of discussion about these issues. And for me, the interesting part of the discussion is not anymore. So for example, if you asked me 10 years ago, hey man, is America going to collapse? I would have told you, yeah, I'm pretty sure it is, and we can have a little debate. And then if you asked me 8 years ago, I would have been like, all right, it's not interesting. It's definitely happening, right? I mean, the numbers tell me the story, and the story's not going to change. So we're at the same point now for our civilization. We need biggest wave of investment in human history. Let me give you one more set of numbers before we close. We talked about doubling our investment rate. Our GDP as a world is about, depending on how you count it, let's say 90 trillion. Okay. We need to double our investment rate to half of 90 trillion, $45 trillion from the current rate of maybe something like 20 trillion. $25 trillion. That's how much we need to spend now. 2 decades. Or that's it. The temperature rises by 4 or 5 degrees and the game is over. That is it. I mean, that is the reality of civilizational economics. There's only one.
But I can tell you it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Right?
You know it's not going to happen because there'll never be a bipartisan agreement on this.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so the reason that I say that is to really say it's not going to happen. Right? And so the interesting part of the discussion to me then becomes, what happens after? What happens next? So it doesn't mean that it means a lot of terrible things, right? It means millions. We're already at 5 million people. You can easily multiply that by 100 and not even come close to how many people are going to die over the next century of all this stuff. The question is, what happens after? Where does civilization go from here? Is this it, right? Like, is this all we're capable of? We became like these kind of like semi-evolved apes, and then we killed off the Neanderthals, and we dominated the planet. And, as I say in that, I don't know if it was in that essay, Age of Extinction, or the one before it, I said, we began in fratricide. So we killed off the Neanderthals, and maybe we ended in matricide, just killing off the planet. And then we just go back to kind of like, eking out a living wherever we can. And we have these, pockets of weird theocratic states and fascist states, and nature kind of like slowly creeps back in, and there's a pandemic here and a failed system there, and, more and more of us are just going every year.
It's pretty desperate. I mean, I've been thinking, we do need to finish, but I've been thinking about the families of the school shooting victims. And I've been thinking of those who were injured and not killed. And I was thinking about how the hospitals will be making money out of these victims. And I've been thinking about the system that basically enriches others, because
Yeah.
the pandemic was extremely profitable for the healthcare industry
Yes.
in America. They
Yes.
made 3 or 4 times more money
Yep.
than they'd ever made before.
Yep.
And as we can see, American healthcare, it was set up for profit, not for a pandemic. And so they took advantage of that. We're seeing it now with gas prices, where the oil companies are claiming that it's costing them money, so they're putting the prices up, when in fact they're just making record profit.
Absolutely right.
So we're living in a period where there is an evil. I mean, there is evil at the heart of a lot of these decisions. The decisions by Republicans not to engage on gun control, the decisions by oil companies to take advantage of the people who can least afford it, because wealthy people don't care if they're paying $8 for gas, but the average person now can't afford to drive to work.
Exactly right.
So we are seeing a collapse on multiple levels, and it's happening in plain view. It's in front of our very eyes. And it takes people like yourself to kind of connect the dots here and to present this information in a cohesive manner. And I'm very grateful to you for doing that. And we have to finish, but I'm thrilled that we got the opportunity to talk, because I read you every day, and I really feel like you're talking to me, and that's really
fantastic.
the greatest gift that you have. So thank you, Umair Haque. I appreciate your time. Don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News daily podcast, which drops every morning so you can listen while you make your morning coffee. And please leave an iTunes review. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.